In 1927, a printed cookbook gave a recipe the plainest name imaginable: the school sandwich. Bread, butter, a spoonful of brown sugar. That's it. That's what a lot of grandmothers packed when the icebox was bare, and no kid ever complained because it tasted like being loved. That's the whole secret behind this list. 30 snacks, and every single one used exactly 3 ingredients. Nothing hidden, nothing fancy, just what was already sitting in the kitchen. Number 4 takes a plain boiled potato and turns it into candy, and you will not believe it's real until you see it done. You will hear exactly how before this video is over. Nobody packs a lunchbox like this anymore. So let's bring all 30 back, starting with number 30. Before the days of vacuum-sealed candy bars, there was a trick almost every grandmother knew. Melt sugar and corn syrup together in a heavy pot until it turns deep amber. Then stir in a spoonful of baking soda and watch it explode into a foaming golden lava that triples in size right before your eyes. Poured out and cooled, it hardens into something light as a sponge and shatters like glass, with hundreds of tiny air pockets trapping a toasty caramel sweetness. Kids called it sponge candy, others called it sea foam, but everyone in the kitchen knew to stand back from the pot. It cost pennies and used what was already in the cupboard. Today, the chemistry trick that made it rise has mostly been forgotten, replaced by candy bars wrapped in plastic, and the sound of that first foaming crackle has gone quiet in most American kitchens. When the apple bin had more bruised and soft fruit than anyone could eat fresh, nothing went to waste. The apples got cooked down into a smooth sauce, sweetened, dusted with cinnamon, then spread thin across a baking sheet and left in a low, slow oven until it turned tacky and chewy instead of wet. Cut into strips and rolled in wax paper, it slipped into a lunch pail without a spoon, a napkin, or a mess, just a sweet tart chew that lasted through recess. It was less a treat someone planned and more a way of saving fruit that would have spoiled by Friday. As grocery stores filled with cheap, always-in-season fruit and store shelves filled with sugary rolled snacks in bright wrappers, the homemade version, patient, thin, and entirely fruit, quietly disappeared from kitchens that once made it out of habit, not indulgence. Penuche was the candy a household made when there was brown sugar in the tin but no chocolate on the shelf. Brown sugar, milk, and butter went into a pot and cooked slowly until it reached the softball stage, a patient, watchful process with no thermometer in some kitchens, just an ear for the sound of the bubbles changing. Beaten by hand until it turned from glossy to matte, it set into a fudge the color of wet sand, tasting of deep caramel and brown butter, sweeter and softer than anything chocolate could give. It demanded a cook who knew exactly when to stop stirring. Too soon, and it never set. Too long, and it turned to sugar in the pot. That kind of patience, and that kind of trust in your own hands over a recipe card, is what's mostly vanished from the American kitchen along with it.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
This one needed no oven at all. Corn syrup and peanut butter melted together on the stovetop into a smooth, glossy syrup, then poured straight over a bowl of cornflakes and stirred until every flake was coated. Dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper, it set up in minutes into small, craggy clusters, crisp on the first bite, chewy and nutty underneath, with that unmistakable peanut butter richness holding it all together. It was the kind of candy a church cookbook loved. 3 ingredients, no baking, no waiting, and enough to fill a whole plate for a potluck table. As boxed granola bars and store-bought candy took over the pantry shelf, the humble stovetop cornflake candy, sticky-fingered, homemade, gone in one bite, slipped quietly out of rotation, remembered mostly by the ones who still keep a battered recipe card with peanut butter stains on the corner. Every fall, When pumpkins were split open for carving or for pie, nothing about them went in the trash. The seeds were rinsed, tossed with melted butter and a good pinch of salt, then spread on a pan and roasted until they turned golden and started to pop and crackle in the oven. Pulled out warm, they were crisp outside, tender within, salty enough to make you reach for another handful before the bowl even cooled. It cost nothing beyond the pumpkin already sitting on the porch, and it turned kitchen scraps into an afternoon snack the whole family fought over. As jack-o'-lanterns gave way to store-bought pumpkin spice everything, and pre-roasted seeds started showing up in bags at the grocery store, the ritual of scooping, rinsing, and roasting your own seeds by hand, the smell filling the whole house, became something fewer families do every autumn. At Christmas, when the good tins came out and company was expected, sugared walnuts were the treat that made a plain dish look like it took all day. Egg whites, whipped just until frothy, were tossed with sugar and walnut halves until every piece was coated in a thin, sandy glaze, then baked low and slow until the shell turned crisp and matte white. What came out of the oven crackled the moment you bit into it, sweet on the outside, deeply nutty and slightly bitter underneath, the way only a real walnut can be. Set out in a cut-glass bowl by the door, they disappeared by the handful before dinner was even served. As boxed holiday candy and pre-glazed nuts took over the grocery aisle every December, the quiet ritual of whipping egg whites by hand for a single bowl of walnuts became one more small, patient tradition that few families still bother to keep. In the South, no gathering felt complete without a tin of cheese straws on the table. Sharp cheddar, worked into a simple dough with butter and flour, rolled thin and cut into long, delicate strips before baking until they turned crisp and faintly golden at the edges. This is the plain, three-ingredient version. Many family recipes added a pinch of cayenne or salt for extra bite, but the bones of it were always the same. Cheese, butter, flour, worked together by hand until it held. They snapped clean in half with a satisfying crack, tasting sharp and buttery all at once, gone in 2 bites. Sent to church socials and funeral receptions alike, they were a dish every good cook was expected to know by heart. As bagged crackers and pre-shredded cheese made the shortcuts too easy to resist, the rolled, hand-cut cheese straw, a little labor, a lot of pride, slipped quietly off most Southern tables. For a treat that looked far fancier than it was, nothing beat a plate of stuffed dates. Each date was split open, filled with a spoonful of softened cream cheese, and topped with a single walnut half pressed in gently. 3 ingredients arranged instead of cooked, ready in the time it took to set the table. The first bite gave that contrast good desserts are built on, the date's sticky caramel sweetness against the cool, tangy cream cheese, and the walnut's clean, bitter crunch. Because of the cream cheese, these needed to stay chilled and never sat out all afternoon at a potluck the way a pie could. They were the dish a hostess brought when she wanted to look like she'd tried harder than she had. As store-bought party trays became the easier choice, the small ceremony of splitting, filling, and pressing each date by hand quietly disappeared from most family gatherings. Long before microwave bags took over the pantry, popcorn was made the way a carnival still makes it. Kernels popped in hot oil in a heavy pot, with sugar added right alongside them so it melted and caramelized onto every kernel as it popped. The trick was keeping the pot moving so nothing scorched, listening for the popping to slow before pulling it from the heat. What landed in the bowl was crunchy, faintly sweet, with a thin candied shell that stuck lightly to your fingers, nothing like the buttery, salty bag from the grocery store. It turned a few cents worth of kernels and sugar into a treat that filled the whole kitchen with a warm, toasted smell. As microwave bags made popcorn a 3-minute affair, the stovetop version, watched carefully, shaken by hand, timed by ear instead of a beep, became something fewer people ever learned to make. Round the holidays, a date nut roll was the candy a woman was known for. Dates and walnuts ground together into a thick, sticky paste, worked with her hands until it held its shape, then rolled into a long log and dusted heavily in powdered sugar. Wrapped tightly in wax paper and twisted at both ends like a piece of saltwater taffy, it kept in a cool pantry for weeks, ready to be unwrapped and sliced into thin, chewy coins whenever company came by. Each slice was dense and naturally sweet, the dates doing all the work a candy thermometer usually would. It required no oven, no cooking, just patience and strong hands to work the paste smooth. As pre-made holiday candy trays became the easier gift to bring, the rolled, hand-sliced log that once sat in nearly every farmhouse pantry at Christmas has become something almost nobody remembers how to make. Some candies didn't need a recipe card at all, just a warm bowl and a spoon. Chocolate, melted slowly so it never scorched, got stirred together with salted peanuts and a handful of raisins, then dropped by spoonfuls onto wax paper and left to set on the counter, or, in summer, out on the back porch where it was cooler. No baking, no thermometer, no waiting for an oven to heat, just melt, stir, drop, and wait for the chocolate to firm up again. What you got was a little cluster of contrast in every bite. The chocolate rich and slightly bitter, the peanuts salty and crunchy, and the raisins chewy with a sudden burst of sweetness that caught you off guard if you weren't expecting it. This is a version of the treat, not a dated original, but the bones of it, salty nuts and dried fruit bound in melted chocolate, are as old as the pantry itself, a way of using up whatever was left in the cupboard drawer. It traveled well in a tin, didn't melt easily if kept out of direct sun, and made a lunchbox feel a little special without costing much at all. As packaged trail mix and branded candy bars filled the same roll with none of the effort, the homemade cluster, a little uneven, a little different every batch, became something fewer people bothered making from scratch. Jam pinwheels were the trick a mother used when bread was going stale and there wasn't much else in the pantry to send along, a way of stretching the last of a loaf into something worth packing rather than throwing the heel to the birds. The crusts got trimmed away first, saved sometimes for bread pudding or given to the chickens if a family kept any, and the soft slice underneath rolled flat with a rolling pin, gently but firmly, until it went thin and pliable without tearing. A slice rolled too hard split right through, and the whole thing had to start over with a fresh piece. Once flattened, it got spread edge to edge with softened butter and a spoonful of whatever jam was on hand, strawberry, grape, whatever the cellar shelf still had left over from a summer of canning, sometimes a jar with the label long gone and nobody quite remembering which batch it was from. Rolled up tight from one end to the other, pressed firm as it went, it held its shape just long enough to rest a moment and then be sliced crosswise into neat little pinwheels, each one showing a perfect spiral of jam through the center, tighter and more even the more practice a mother had at rolling. They were soft, a little sweet, a little buttery, and they looked far more impressive arranged on a plate than the handful of ordinary ingredients that went into them ever let on, which made them a favorite for both a child's lunch pail on an ordinary Tuesday and a lady's luncheon plate on a Saturday afternoon, the very same recipe serving two entirely different occasions without anyone thinking twice about it. There was no baking involved, no cooking beyond softening the butter to spreading consistency, just a rolling pin, a steady hand, and bread that might otherwise have gone stale and wasted sitting on the counter. Set out on a tray with the crusts trimmed and the spirals showing, they looked like something bought from a proper bakery rather than assembled from the tail end of a loaf, which was exactly the quiet trick of them, dressing up almost nothing into something that photographed and tasted like effort. As pre-sliced bread got softer and less able to hold up to rolling without tearing, and jam started arriving in squeeze bottles built for spreading straight onto a sandwich rather than being spooned and spread by hand, the extra step of rolling and slicing a pinwheel started to feel unnecessary. One more thing nobody had the 10 spare minutes for anymore. It's a small, patient trick that's mostly vanished from kitchens that now reach for a sandwich bag instead of a rolling pin. Popcorn balls were a treat built for using your hands, start to finish, and there was no way around getting sticky in the process. Corn popped fresh on the stovetop, kernel by kernel cracking against the lid until the sound finally slowed and the pot came off the heat, got picked through quickly for any stubborn, unpopped kernels before going into a big bowl, still warm and smelling faintly of butter from the popping itself. Marshmallows, melted slowly in a saucepan with butter until glossy and smooth, no lumps left anywhere in the pot, got poured over the top while still hot and stirred through fast before it had a chance to cool and seize, working it all the way to the bottom of the bowl until every single kernel wore a shiny coat of marshmallow. Then came the part every kid remembers most clearly. Hands buttered up thick to keep from sticking, though some marshmallow always found its way onto your fingers anyway, working the hot, sticky popcorn into tight, round balls as fast as you could before the marshmallow cooled and set, racing the clock with your own 2 palms. Wrapped individually in wax paper cut into squares ahead of time and twisted tight at the top like a piece of candy, they were sweet, chewy, and satisfyingly messy, with just enough crunch left in the popcorn to keep every bite interesting instead of turning to mush. They showed up at Halloween, handed out instead of store candy to trusted neighbors, at church fall festivals set out by the dozen on long tables, and in lunch pails whenever a mother had made a big batch the night before, specifically so every child in the house could have one to carry to school the next morning. The whole process took over the kitchen for an afternoon, the smell of melting marshmallow drifting through the house, the counters gone sticky no matter how careful anyone tried to be, the wax paper cut into stacks ahead of time so nothing slowed down the rolling once the marshmallow was hot and ready. It cost next to nothing to make a whole batch, just popcorn already sitting in the pantry and a single bag of marshmallows from the store, stretched into more treats than a bag of store candy ever could have bought. As bagged candy took over the Halloween bowl by the fistful and store-bought popcorn balls started appearing on shelves already wrapped and ready, needing nothing from anyone, the hands-on version, sticky fingers, uneven shapes, the fun and the mess of rolling your own before the marshmallow cooled too much to shape, became a tradition fewer families still gather in the kitchen to make together every fall. Long before granola bars came individually wrapped in foil, there was Gorp, a simple mix of peanuts, raisins, and a handful of chocolate candies, stirred together in whatever bowl or coffee can was on hand and scooped into a small bag or tin for the lunch pail. Some families claimed the name itself came from an old shorthand for the ingredients inside it, though nobody could ever quite agree on the story, and most people who made it never wondered about the name at all. It was just what you called the mix in the jar by the door. There was no cooking involved, no measuring beyond a rough handful of each poured straight from whatever containers happened to be open that week, just combining what was already sitting in the pantry into something that felt like a treat instead of leftovers scraped together at the last minute. It gave a little of everything in one handful, salty peanuts, chewy sweet raisins, and the occasional bite of chocolate that made you want to keep digging for more, never quite knowing which one your fingers would land on next, which was half the fun of eating it by the fistful rather than all at once. It was portable, didn't spoil in a warm lunchbox the way something creamy or chocolate-heavy might on its own, and could be made in bulk on a Sunday afternoon. A big batch stirred up in a mixing bowl and divided into small bags to last the whole week of school lunches ahead without anyone having to think about snacks again until Friday. Families packed it for road trips too, a coffee can of it riding on the seat between the kids for hours, and for hikes where anything that might melt or crush was left behind entirely. Gorp surviving a jostled backpack better than almost any other snack on this list. The proportions were never exact and rarely the same twice. 1 week heavier on raisins, because that's what was left in the box. Another week with more chocolate, because someone had just gotten paid, which meant no 2 batches from the same kitchen ever tasted quite identical, and nobody minded. As branded snack mixes and individually wrapped bars took over the school lunch aisle, promising the same combination in a tidy, portioned package, without any of the mess of mixing it yourself at the counter, the simple habit of stirring together whatever was in the cupboard that particular week different every time, never measured, never quite the same twice, quietly faded from most kitchens, replaced by something more consistent but a little less like it belonged to any one family in particular. Cream cheese mints were less an everyday lunchbox snack and more the treat that showed up on special occasions. A wedding, a baby shower, a church tea, worked by hand from softened cream cheese, powdered sugar, and just a few drops of peppermint extract, kneaded together like dough on a sugared board until it turned smooth and pliable, no longer sticky against your palms. Pinched off into small balls, each one rolled between two fingers until perfectly round, then pressed lightly into candy molds shaped like flowers or shells or sometimes tiny baskets, the pattern coming away clean the moment the mint was popped free. They were left to firm up on a tray in the icebox before being arranged in careful rows, never stacked, so no design got crushed against another. Because of the cream cheese, they had to stay chilled and were never left sitting out for long, brought from the icebox only once the guests had actually arrived, which meant they weren't the kind of thing that traveled well in a warm lunch pail left in a school bag all morning, but a child lucky enough to bring a few home wrapped in a napkin from someone else's party tray considered it a real prize, something rarer than anything usually found in their own kitchen. Making a full tray by hand, one pinch and one press at a time, sometimes 200 or 300 of them for a large wedding, was an afternoon's work reserved for occasions worth the trouble, often done by more than one pair of hands around the same table, trading off the rolling and the pressing so no one's fingers gave out first. As pre-made mints and grocery store candy trays became the easier choice for showers and teas alike, ordered rather than made, the hand-molded version, soft, cool, faintly floral in shape, judged one tray at a time by hands that had made hundreds before, became something fewer people still know how to make. When dried fruit sat in the pantry longer than anyone planned, edging past its best and starting to toughen at the edges, this was the way to use it up rather than let it go to waste. Dried apricots got ground through a hand grinder or chopped fine with a knife until they turned into something closer to a paste than distinct pieces. That got worked together with shredded coconut and a can of sweetened condensed milk, stirred and folded until the mixture turned thick, sticky, and easy to shape between your palms, holding together the moment it was pressed rather than crumbling apart. Rolled into small balls and set on a plate to firm up in the icebox, they needed no baking at all, just a bowl, a spoon, and patience while the cold and the condensed milk together set everything into shape over an hour or two. What came out was chewy and dense, tart from the apricot in a way that cut nicely against the sweetness, rich from the condensed milk, with coconut giving every bite a little texture against all that smoothness, never quite letting the mixture feel too soft or too sweet on its own. This is the plain, uncoated version. Some families rolled theirs in extra coconut for a little more bite on the outside, or dusted them in powdered sugar the way a fancier candy might be finished. As fresh fruit became available in every season instead of just a few months a year, and canned condensed milk stopped being the pantry staple it once was in most homes, the humble apricot ball, rolled by hand between two palms, a little different every batch depending on how ripe the apricots had gone, slipped quietly out of most family recipe boxes, its whole purpose undone by a pantry that no longer let anything sit long enough to need using up. Before the orange paper packet of peanut butter crackers ever showed up in a vending machine, this was how a family made their own version at home, standing at the counter some mornings with a box of saltines torn open and a jar of peanut butter already soft from sitting out overnight. A spoonful of peanut butter got spread across one saltine, all the way to the edges so no bite came up short, a small dab of jelly across another, and the two pressed together into a small, tidy sandwich, careful not to press so hard the cracker cracked in your hand. 3 ingredients: no bread, no knife required beyond whatever was already spreading the peanut butter. The saltiness of the cracker against the rich peanut butter and the sudden sweetness of the jelly made a combination that felt like a treat, even though it cost almost nothing to put together, the salt doing more work than anyone gave it credit for, cutting through the sweetness just enough to keep you reaching for the next one. A batch could be made in a few minutes at the kitchen table, several at once, lined up in a row before the wax paper wrapping even started, and dropped into a lunch pail still holding their crisp shape, unlike a soft sandwich that could get crushed flat by the time lunch period rolled around. Kids liked that they could eat them in small bites, working through a whole stack instead of one big sandwich that had to be finished in order, trading extras with a friend at the lunch table if the jelly flavor didn't match what someone else had brought. Mothers liked that a box of saltines and a jar of peanut butter, both slow to spoil and cheap to begin with, went a long way across a whole week of lunches without anyone noticing the same thing had shown up twice. As branded cracker sandwiches took over the snack aisle, individually wrapped in orange plastic and standardized down to the last bite so everyone tasted exactly like the last, the homemade version, a little uneven, spread a little thicker some mornings than others, made fresh at the counter rather than pulled from a machine, became something fewer families still bother assembling themselves. This is the shortcut version of coconut macaroons that took over most home kitchens once canned condensed milk became a pantry staple. Shredded coconut stirred straight into sweetened condensed milk with a splash of vanilla. No egg whites to whip, no double boiler, no fuss. Just a bowl and a spoon and a bag of coconut torn open at the counter. Dropped by spoonfuls onto a baking sheet, mounded up into little peaks rather than flattened. They baked just long enough for the edges and peaks to turn a deep golden brown, while the inside stayed soft, chewy, and impossibly sweet, holding its shape through the heat, without ever spreading thin the way a cookie dough would. Pulled warm from the oven, they filled the whole kitchen with the smell of toasting coconut, sweet and faintly nutty, a smell that reached the front hall before the pan even hit the cooling rack. The golden tips, crisp from direct heat, gave way to a center that was almost custardy right out of the oven before it cooled and firmed up into something chewier, denser, more substantial to bite into. They held together well enough to pack in a tin without crumbling apart the way a more delicate cookie might on a bumpy car ride, which made them a favorite for both a lunch pail on a Monday and a church bake sale table on a Saturday, equally at home in either setting. It was the kind of recipe passed along less through a family cookbook and more through the back of a condensed milk can itself, read once and then simply remembered, since there was hardly anything to the method beyond stir, scoop, and bake, memorized by anyone who'd made it more than a time or two, the proportions settling into muscle memory rather than needing to be measured out again each time. Neighbors traded the recipe by word of mouth as often as by paper, each swearing their version, with a little more vanilla or a little less coconut, was the one worth keeping. As boxed cookies and packaged coconut treats took over the dessert shelf, promising the same chewy sweetness without the sticky fingers, the simple 3-ingredient macaroon, made from nothing more than a can and a bag of coconut, baked in a kitchen that briefly smelled like a candy shop, became something fewer people still bother making from scratch. Peanut butter fudge was the candy a kitchen could make without ever turning on the stove for long, and without any of the fussing that chocolate fudge demanded even in its easiest form. Peanut butter and softened butter were worked together in a bowl until smooth and fully blended, no lumps of either one left behind, and then powdered sugar went in a little at a time, a cup at a stir, the mixture growing thicker and stiffer with every addition until it finally reached that particular moment every cook learned to recognize by feel, when it stopped clinging wetly to the spoon and started pulling together into something closer to dough, firm enough to hold its own shape when pressed. No candy thermometer, no boiling sugar syrup, no waiting anxiously for a pot to reach a precise temperature on the stove. The whole transformation happened in one bowl, at room temperature, guided by nothing more than how the mixture felt against the spoon and then against your hands once it got stiff enough to knead the last of the sugar in by touch. Pressed into a pan and left to set on the counter, or, if there was a hurry, in the icebox for a faster finish, it cut into dense, rich squares that tasted like the inside of a peanut butter cup, sweet and nutty, with just enough salt already built into the peanut butter itself to keep the whole thing from turning cloying the way some sugar candies could. It was the fudge a child could help make almost entirely on their own, since there was no hot pot, no open flame, and no risk of a burn to worry about. Just stirring, and then kneading with clean hands until it felt right, a task easy enough to hand over and trust completely. That made it a favorite for a rainy afternoon when a child needed something to do and a mother needed something that wouldn't demand her full attention the whole time. The two of them could put it together in 15 minutes at the kitchen table, licking powdered sugar off their fingers, and have it set and ready to eat by supper time without either of them standing over a stove all day. It required only what was already sitting in most pantries: a jar of peanut butter, a stick of butter softened on the counter, and a bag of powdered sugar. No special trip to the store, no ingredient that wasn't already accounted for in the weekly shopping. As boxed candy and pre-made fudge, wrapped and dated on a grocery shelf, took over the treat aisle and made homemade candy feel like an unnecessary extra step, the no-cook version that used to come together on a kitchen counter in one bowl, kneaded by small hands as much as grown ones, became something fewer people remember was ever this simple to make. Once canned condensed milk found its way into the pantry, chocolate fudge stopped being the all-afternoon project it once was. The old way demanded real nerve: sugar, butter, and milk cooked slowly in a heavy pot, watched constantly for the exact moment it reached the soft ball stage, tested by dropping a bit into cold water and reading how it behaved between your fingers, then beaten by hand or with a wooden spoon until your arm ached and the mixture finally turned from glossy to matte. Get any part of it wrong, cook it a minute too long, stop beating a minute too soon, and the whole batch turned grainy and sugary, ruined beyond saving, an afternoon's work and a stick of butter gone to waste. The condensed milk version threw all of that out entirely. Chocolate chips, melted slowly with a can of sweetened condensed milk and a splash of vanilla, came together into a smooth, glossy mixture in a matter of minutes, stirred over low heat until it turned thick and shining. No candy thermometer, no beating until your arm ached, none of the guesswork that traditional fudge demanded from a cook standing anxiously over a hot pot, checking and rechecking whether it was ready. Poured into a pan and left to set in the icebox rather than cooked to a precise temperature on the stove, it firmed up in a few hours into rich, dense squares that tasted every bit as good, some said even better, than the version that took an hour of careful cooking and a fair amount of luck. This was the recipe printed right on the back of the condensed milk can itself. No cookbook required, and it spread through kitchens fast because it worked every single time, with none of the disasters, grainy, sugary fudge that never set right, thrown out after all that effort, that plagued the old-fashioned method for anyone whose nerve or timing wasn't perfect. It became the fudge every mother could make the night before a bake sale or a holiday gathering without worrying whether it would turn out, without the late-night panic of a ruined pot, and no time left to start over. Cut into small squares and stacked in a tin lined with wax paper, it traveled well to church socials and neighbors' porches alike, keeping for days without drying out or turning hard, the way careless batches of the old kind sometimes did, as boxed fudge mixes and store-bought candy bars took over the shelf, promising the same result with even less effort: the simple 3-ingredient version, melted, poured, and chilled, printed on the back of a can millions of kitchens once kept, became something fewer people realize used to be the easiest, most foolproof candy in the whole kitchen. By the 1930s, a candy had shown up in American kitchens that broke every rule chocolate candy was supposed to follow. It was supposed to be smooth, glossy, and even, and this one was deliberately lumpy, deliberately uneven, and deliberately named after the roughest road anyone could think of, right in the thick of hard times, when a name like that felt less like a joke and more like the truth. Chocolate, melted slow and low so it never seized or turned grainy, got folded together with a generous handful of mini marshmallows and a scattering of walnuts. The spoon working through the warm chocolate just enough to coat everything without melting the marshmallows into nothing, then spread into a pan and left to set in a cool spot rather than a hot oven, sometimes on a windowsill in winter when the kitchen itself ran warm from the stove. What came out, once it firmed up and got cut into rough, unequal squares, was a candy. Picture a kitchen counter covered in wax paper, dozens of small golden mounds cooling in uneven little peaks. That was the scene behind butterscotch haystacks, a candy that looked like it took real skill and required almost none. Butterscotch chips, melted carefully over low heat, sometimes over a double boiler for anyone who'd been burned before, because butterscotch scorches faster and less forgivingly than chocolate ever does, and one distracted minute, Kirch bake sale tables leaned on them heavily, sitting out under plastic wrap, unlike anything with cream or custard in it. As those tins of chow mein noodles disappeared from ordinary grocery shelves, pushed to a specialty aisle few people wandered into anymore, and the candy plate got replaced by store-bought cookies wrapped in cellophane, the haystack, odd-shaped, faintly nostalgic, built softened butter got creamed with sugar until it turned pale and fluffy, the color lightening and the texture loosening as air worked its way in, the kind of change you could feel happening under the spoon before you could fully see it. Then flour was worked in just, until the dough came together, never overmixed, never rushed, because too much handling woke up the flour's gluten and turned a delicate, crumbly cookie into something tough and ordinary. Pressed into a pan or rolled and cut into long fingers, it baked low and slow until the edges turned the faintest gold, never dark, never crisp the way a sugar cookie would be. The whole point was restraint, pulling it from the oven before it ever browned properly. What came out was dense, sandy, and rich, crumbling apart at the first bite in a way that felt more like eating butter than eating a cookie, because, in the truest sense, that's mostly what it was, with flour and sugar there mainly to hold the butter's shape together. There was no egg, no leavening, no ingredient list to double-check against the pantry shelf, which meant a batch could be started on a whim with whatever was already sitting on the counter, no trip to the store required, and no waiting on anything to come to room temperature beyond the butter itself. It traveled well in a tin, kept for weeks without going stale, and was the cookie a woman made when she wanted something that tasted like it came from a proper bakery rather than a home kitchen, the kind she'd set out when the good company was coming rather than the everyday kind. Grandmothers taught daughters the ratio by feel rather than by measuring cup, pressing the dough between their fingers until it felt right, watching for the exact moment it stopped being crumbly and started holding together on its own, a kind of knowledge passed down through touch more than through writing, learned at an elbow rather than from a page. As pre-made cookie dough and bakery shortbread in plastic trays took over that job, promising the same buttery crumble without any of the creaming or waiting, the ratio that used to live in the back of every baker's mind, 1, 2, 3, became something fewer people ever bothered to memorize, folded into a recipe card instead of a hand. The name itself was the whole point, and it wasn't a marketing trick. It described exactly what you were supposed to do. Egg whites whipped patiently until they turned stiff and glossy, holding a peak straight up when the beater lifted away, got folded together with sugar and a handful of chocolate chips, gently, so as not to knock all that trapped air back out. This being the stripped-down, three-ingredient version of a recipe that many households built up further with a splash of vanilla or a scattering of nuts, depending on what was in the pantry that week. Dropped by spoonfuls onto a baking sheet, they went into an oven that had just been turned off, still holding all its heat from whatever had baked before, the door shut tight, and then, this was the trick. You were meant to walk away and forget about them entirely, sometimes overnight, letting that trapped, slowly fading heat dry the meringue from the outside in, rather than baking it the usual way with direct, active heat. It worked because meringue doesn't need to cook so much as it needs to dry out gently, and a switched-off oven, still warm from supper, did exactly that without anyone having to watch a clock or set a timer. Hours later, whoever remembered would open the oven to find pale, crisp little clouds, delicate as eggshell on the outside and just faintly chewy in the center, studded with chocolate that had softened and set again as they cooled, each one nearly weightless when picked up, dissolving almost the moment it hit your tongue. It was a recipe built for a household that didn't want to waste egg whites left over from another dessert. A pound cake, a custard, anything that called for yolks alone, and one that asked nothing of the cook except patience and a good memory, which, given the name, was often exactly what was missing. More than one family told the same story, laughing every time. Someone had put a batch in before bed, forgotten them entirely as promised, and rediscovered the pan 2 full days later, half amazed they'd survived the wait at all. Church cookbooks passed the recipe, along with a wink, half joke and half genuine instruction, printed right next to a warning not to peek, because opening that oven door too soon let all the trapped heat escape and ruined the whole batch. As electric ovens grew more efficient at holding and losing heat on a schedule, and as households grew more cautious about leaving any appliance on overnight, an all-night forgotten oven started to feel like a risk nobody wanted to take. The cookie built entirely around being forgotten became, fittingly, one of the few recipes lost not to changing taste or a busier kitchen, but to caution itself. There's a candy that's become famous under a nickname borrowed from a tree, dressed up with butter and vanilla and rolled in a very particular way. But this is the plainer cousin that came before all that, the version a household made with just what was on the shelf. Peanut butter and powdered sugar were kneaded together by hand until the mixture turned firm and slightly dry, easy to roll into small, tight balls between your palms. The kind of task that got handed to whichever child in the kitchen had the steadiest hands and the most patience for repetition. Each ball went onto a toothpick or the tines of a fork, dipped down into a pot of chocolate, melted slowly over simmering water so it never scorched or turned grainy, then lifted out with a gentle shake to let the excess drip away before it was set down on a sheet of wax paper to firm back up in a cool corner of the kitchen. What resulted was dense and rich, the peanut butter center holding its shape against a shell of chocolate that cracked cleanly with the first bite, sweet and salty in exactly the proportion that keeps a person reaching for a second one before finishing the first. And most people, if they're honest, reached for a third before admitting they'd lost count. Or the tines of a fork, dipped down into a pot of chocolate, melted slowly over simmering water so it never scorched or turned grainy, then lifted out with a gentle shake to let the excess drip away before it was set down on a sheet of wax paper to firm back up in a cool corner of the kitchen. What resulted was dense and rich, the peanut butter center holding its shape against a shell of chocolate that cracked cleanly with the first bite, sweet and salty in exactly the proportion that keeps a person reaching for a second one before finishing the first. And most people, if they're honest, reached for a third before admitting they'd lost count. It required no oven, no baking sheet, just a mixing bowl, a double boiler for the chocolate, and hands willing to get sticky, rolling out 2 or 3 dozen at a time. An afternoon's task that usually ended with more chocolate on the cook's fingers than on the wax paper. Because it needed nothing more than pantry staples, it became the candy a mother could pull together the night before a holiday without a trip to the store, and the one a child could help roll without much risk of ruining it, which made it as much a family activity as it was a recipe. Set out on a plate at Christmas, alongside the fudge and the sugared nuts, they rarely lasted through the evening, and a tin of them was considered a fine enough gift to carry next door to a neighbor without any embarrassment about how little it had cost to make. Some families rolled theirs a little larger, some a little smaller. Some added a pinch of salt on top before the chocolate set. But the bones of the recipe stayed the same in kitchen after kitchen for generations. As that fancier, buttered version took over the holiday plate and earned its own famous name, showing up in bakery cases and church cookbooks under its new identity, this simpler, 3-ingredient original, a little less rich, a little easier to make on a Tuesday, with nothing to its name but what it was, quietly stepped back and let the newer version take all the credit. You already heard how this one starts. A 1927 cookbook, 3 words for a recipe: bread, butter, sugar. But there's more to the story than the opening allowed, because the strange part isn't that someone made a sandwich out of almost nothing. It's that someone thought it needed writing down at all. Cookbooks from that era were often built for young brides and new mothers who hadn't yet learned what their own mothers knew by instinct. And somewhere in that instruction was a quiet acknowledgement. Some days, this is what you'll have, and it's enough. A slice of bread got spread edge to edge with softened butter, then dusted generously with brown sugar. Not white, which stayed dry and gritty on top, but brown, which the butter's warmth would soften just slightly into something closer to a thin caramel glaze, once the sandwich sat a moment before folding. Some households pressed a second slice on top and cut it corner to corner, the way a proper sandwich was supposed to look, even when everyone at the table knew exactly what was and wasn't inside it. It traveled well, needed no icebox, cost less than a penny a slice, and filled a stomach through a long school afternoon, when the alternative might have been nothing at all. Children carried it without embarrassment, because in a schoolyard full of tin lunch pails during the leanest years, a butter and sugar sandwich wasn't unusual, it was simply Tuesday. What made it last in family memory wasn't the taste, sweet and simple as it was, but the fact that it appeared exactly when it needed to, without anyone making a production of what was missing. As grocery store shelves filled back up through the following decades, and school cafeterias began serving hot lunches instead of what a child carried from home, the plain sandwich quietly stopped being anyone's daily bread. It's rarely made anymore, not because anyone forgot how, but because most kitchens never need it to be enough again, which is, in its own way, exactly what that 1927 recipe was hoping for. Here it is, the one promised at the very start, and it deserves the full explanation, because seeing it done is the only way to believe it. It begins with a single potato, boiled until it falls apart at the touch of a fork, then mashed and pushed through a ricer or a fine strainer until every last lump is gone and what's left is smooth. The name out loud to almost anyone who grew up in this country, and you won't need to explain a single thing. The picture appears immediately, the way only a handful of recipes ever manage. A stick of celery, washed and trimmed, got its curved channel filled edge to edge with peanut butter, thick enough to hold its shape, and then raisins were pressed in a neat row along the top, each one an ant marching down the log. There was no cooking, no waiting, Nothing more complicated than a butter knife and a steady hand, which made it the rare treat a child could assemble entirely on their own the moment they were old enough to be trusted with a knife that wasn't sharp. The bite was built on contrast, the way the best simple foods always are. The celery, cool, crisp, and faintly bitter. The peanut butter, thick and salty sweet. The raisins, chewy and bursting with a concentrated sweetness that balanced the whole thing out. It cost almost nothing, used ingredients that sat in nearly every pantry and icebox at once, and required no adult supervision beyond the first lesson in how to fill the channel without breaking the stalk. It showed up in lunch pails, at after-school snack time, and at birthday parties where a tray of them disappeared before the cake was even cut. Teachers used it as an early cooking lesson, and mothers used it as an easy way to get a vegetable into a child who'd otherwise have refused it outright. The peanut butter and raisins doing all the persuading. It has never fully disappeared the way some items on this list have. It still shows up in a lunchbox here and there. But the daily, unthinking habit of making it, the way it once was as automatic as packing a napkin, has faded as packaged snacks took over that job. It remains, even now, one of the few things on this entire list that needs no explanation at all. Only the memory of making one yourself. There's a particular kind of disbelief that comes from a good peanut butter cookie, the kind where someone bites in, pauses, and asks what on earth is holding it together, because the honest answer is almost nothing at all. Peanut butter, sugar, and a single egg worked together in one bowl until it formed a soft, sticky dough with no flour, no butter, and no leavening anywhere in sight. Rolled into balls and pressed flat with the tines of a fork, that unmistakable crosshatch pattern that every peanut butter cookie seems to wear, whether or not anyone remembers why. They baked just until the edges firmed and the tops cracked slightly, staying soft and almost fudgy at the center the whole way through. What made it remarkable wasn't just the simplicity, but the density that came from it. Without flour to lighten the structure, every bite was concentrated peanut butter flavor, chewy and rich in a way that flour-based versions never quite achieved. It was a recipe that could be made in the time it took an oven to preheat, using nothing that wasn't already a pantry staple in most American kitchens, which made it the cookie a mother turned to when company was arriving in 20 minutes and the cookie jar was empty. Children loved pressing the fork pattern themselves, watching the dough flatten and crack under their own hands before it ever went in the oven. It traveled well, kept its shape in a lunch pail, and never crumbled the way a more delicate cookie would. As boxed cookie mixes and pre-made dough took over that same 20 minutes before company emergency, the flourless version, 3 ingredients, 1 bowl, 1 fork, became a cookie fewer people realize doesn't need anything more than what's already in the cupboard. And here it is, the one nearly everyone still recognizes on sight, even if fewer people remember it was ever built on nothing but 3 simple things. In 1939, in a Kellogg's test kitchen, 2 women working on a recipe for a Camp Fire Girls fundraiser melted butter and marshmallows together into a smooth, glossy pool, then folded in crisp rice cereal until every piece was coated and glistening. Pressed into a pan while still warm, not packed down too hard, just enough to hold together. It set as it cooled into something with a texture no other treat on this entire list quite matches. A gentle, satisfying crunch, giving way instantly to a soft marshmallow chew, sweet without being heavy, familiar in a way that needed no explanation even the very first time a child tasted it. It required no oven at all, beyond melting butter in a pot, came together in the time it took a kettle to boil, and used 3 ingredients that sat in nearly every pantry in the country, which meant it could be made on a whim, doubled for a bake sale, or stretched thin for a crowd without anyone feeling shorted. Cut into neat squares, wrapped in wax paper, it traveled through decades of lunch pails, church socials, and birthday tables without ever needing to change. Unlike so much on this list, it never fully vanished. You can still find a version of it in nearly every grocery store. But the homemade version, made from a stick of butter and a bag of marshmallows melted by hand rather than pulled pre-packaged from a box, is the one that slipped away from most kitchens. It closes this list the way it should, not with something lost entirely, but with a reminder of how little it ever took to make something everyone remembers. 30 snacks, 3 ingredients each, and not one of them needed anything more than what was already sitting in the kitchen, which was, in the end, always exactly enough. 30 snacks, 30 recipes that never needed more than 3 things from the cupboard, and not one of them ever asked for a special trip to the store. Just a potato already boiling for supper, a can of milk already in the pantry, a bag of marshmallows bought for something else entirely. None of them disappeared because they weren't good enough. A candy that turns a boiled potato into something that tastes like a candy bar doesn't vanish for lack of flavor. A sandwich made of nothing but bread, butter, and a little brown sugar doesn't get forgotten because nobody loved it. They disappeared because the world around them changed, because grocery shelves filled up with things that used to be made by hand, because a wrapped bar in a lunchbox was easier than rolling 30 pinwheels the night before, because it got easier, little by little, to buy the memory instead of make it. But for the length of this video, you just kept 30 of them alive a little longer, simply by watching and remembering. So tell me down in the comments, which one did your grandmother make? Was it the potato candy that fooled you every single time, even after she told you what was in it? Was it the butter and sugar sandwich, packed on the weeks when that's all there was? Or was it something so small and so specific to your own family that it never made it onto anyone else's list, the one only your kitchen ever made, exactly that way? Because that's really how any of this comes back. Not from a video, but from one person in the comments refusing to let a recipe be forgotten, and someone else reading it who suddenly remembers too. If this took you back to a kitchen you haven't thought about in years, subscribe and stay with me. There's a whole pantry of forgotten American food still waiting to be brought back, one 3-ingredient recipe at a time. Thank you for pulling up a seat at this table. I'll see you at the next one.